Imagine a young boy standing on a sun-drenched street in Honolulu, looking out at the Pacific Ocean. The waves crash in the distance, the air smells of salt, of freedom, of dreams. But inside his chest, there's a question. Who am I, really? He doesn't fully belong to one world. His skin is a shade that makes strangers pause. His name is unusual. His story, unfinished. This boy would one day speak to millions, inspire nations, and make history. But right now, at the edge of that ocean, all he can feel is the weight of two identities, two continents, two histories colliding inside him.
Barack Hussein Obama II, a name that decades later would echo across headlines, ballots, and the world stage. But before the White House, before the Nobel Peace Prize, before the impossible became possible, there was the journey, one filled with uncertainty, loss, and reinvention. And it starts far from America. His father, Barack Hussein Obama Sr., was born in Kenya, a tall, brilliant man with a voice that could fill a room and ideas that could challenge the world. His mother, Ann Dunham, was from Kansas, curious, compassionate, and fiercely independent. They met in Hawaii in the early 1960s. It was a time when their love was unconventional, even controversial. An interracial marriage in a country still wrestling with the chains of segregation and prejudice.
Hidden gem fact number 1. When Barack was born in 1961, interracial marriage was still illegal in more than a dozen U.S. states. Barack's earliest memories were not of politics or power, but of warmth. The way his mother's eyes sparkled when she read him bedtime stories, the tropical air that drifted through open windows, the laughter of neighborhood kids. But life shifted quickly. When Barack was just 2 years old, his father left to study at Harvard and never really came back. A few short visits, a handful of letters. That was it. The boy who would one day lead the free world grew up without the man whose name he carried. Still, Anne raised him with quiet strength. She told him stories of a bigger world, of Africa's vast plains, of America's promise, of the idea that kindness could be a form of courage. When Barack was 6, change came again. His mother remarried an Indonesian man named Lolo Sotoro, and the family moved to Jakarta. Suddenly, the warm shores of Hawaii were replaced by the bustling streets of a developing city, motorbikes buzzing past, food stalls sizzling with sauté, roosters crowing at dawn.
Jakarta was vibrant, but also harsh. Barack saw children his age begging barefoot in the streets, carrying water jugs instead of school books. It was here he learned the world wasn't always fair, but that it could be changed. Hidden gem fact number 2. As a boy in Indonesia, Barack had a pet ape named Tata. Life in Jakarta taught him resilience. His stepfather taught him to be tough, to never back down from a challenge. But his mother, she taught him empathy. And that balance of toughness and compassion would one day become his political trademark. When Barack was 10, his mother made a hard choice. She sent him back to Hawaii to live with his grandparents, Madeline and Stanley Dunham, so he could have a better education. It was an act of love that felt to a young boy like another loss. Honolulu became home again. His grandmother, practical and sharp, worked at a bank. His grandfather, full of stories, kept the boy entertained with tales of adventure. And at Punahou School, an elite private academy, Barack found himself surrounded by privilege and expectation. But he also felt different. Not just because of his race, although that was part of it. He was caught between worlds. The Hawaiian laid-back culture, the Midwestern values of his mother's family, the African roots of a father he barely knew. Teenage struggles and college awakening. High school was a paradox for Barack. On the surface, he blended in. A good student, a decent basketball player, someone who could make friends across cliques. But inside, the questions grew louder. Where do I fit? What does my future look like? He was smart, but restless. Sometimes he drifted, losing himself in pickup games, parties, and moments of aimless rebellion. Even then, he was watching, listening, learning, trying on different versions of himself, like clothes in a store. He read James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, Malcolm X, voices that spoke to the complexity of identity, race, and belonging. He scribbled thoughts in notebooks, not yet speeches, but seeds. Hidden gem fact number 3. Barack once admitted he experimented with marijuana and alcohol in high school, saying it was a way to push questions of who I was out of my mind. Graduation came. Most of his classmates were heading straight into defined futures. Barack's path was less certain, but he chose to leap, enrolling first at Occidental College in Los Angeles. Occidental was a world of activism, art, and politics. Here, Barack found himself drawn to debates about injustice, about America's role in the world. But he also knew he wasn't ready yet. After 2 years, he transferred to Columbia University in New York City.
New York was an awakening. It was gritty, electric, unforgiving. He lived in a small apartment in a less than glamorous neighborhood, cooking simple meals, walking the streets late at night. The city had a rhythm, one that demanded you either keep up or get left behind. Barack kept up. He studied political science, international relations, the mechanics of power, but he also absorbed the lessons of the streets, the struggles of the homeless man on the corner, the determination of immigrant shopkeepers, the quiet dignity of the elderly woman selling fruit by the subway. By the time he graduated in 1983, something had shifted. The restless boy had direction. The question was no longer, who am I? It was, how can I help? Still, his life wasn't glamorous. He took a job as a community organizer in Chicago, a role that came with more heart than paycheck. It was here, in the neighborhoods of the South Side, that he began to see leadership not as a title, but as service. He listened to people's frustrations about jobs lost, schools underfunded, housing falling apart. And he realized politics wasn't about abstract policies. It was about real lives.
But Chicago also tested him. It wasn't easy convincing people to trust a young outsider with a strange name. He faced skepticism, disappointment, even failure. Yet each time, he came back, knocking on more doors, sitting in more living rooms, asking more questions. And one day, an older woman looked at him and said, "You've got a gift, young man. Don't waste it." It was a turning point. But to truly make change, he knew he needed a bigger toolbox. That meant law school. Harvard Law School. And not just attending, excelling.
Harvard, history, and Michelle. Harvard Law School. For many, it's the mountaintop. For Barack, it was the next step. From the moment he walked into the lecture halls, people noticed, not just because of his height, his easy smile, or the unusual rhythm of his name, but because when he spoke, the room went quiet. He had a way of connecting big ideas to everyday lives, of making people feel heard,
even in disagreement. Hidden gem fact number 4. Barack became the first African-American president of the prestigious Harvard Law Review in 1990, a position that put him in national headlines for the very first time. That title brought prestige, but also pressure. Reporters wanted interviews. Publishers offered book deals. Some classmates whispered about politics in his future. Barack smiled it off. For now, his focus was on learning and on something far more personal. Her name was Michelle Robinson. Sharp, confident, grounded, she was his mentor during a summer internship at a Chicago law firm. From the beginning, Michelle wasn't impressed by smooth lines or charm. She cared about substance. And Barack, with his quiet intensity and big dreams, had it. They started as colleagues, then friends. Then, one day, Barack asked her out. Michelle hesitated. Dating a coworker wasn't her plan. But eventually, she said yes. Their first date? A mix of ice cream, a Spike Lee movie, and hours of conversation that felt like minutes. Michelle saw something in him. Not just ambition, but a deep desire to make the world better. And Barack saw in her a partner who could match his fire with her own. When he graduated from Harvard, offers flooded in from top law firms. But instead of chasing money, Barack returned to Chicago to work on civil rights cases, teach constitutional law, and keep organizing. Because for him, leadership wasn't about climbing a ladder. It was about lifting others. In 1992, he and Michelle married. It was a wedding filled with laughter, dancing, and the quiet certainty that together they were unstoppable. But marriage didn't mean slowing down. Barack was already becoming a name in Chicago's political circles, someone who could unite communities, cross divides, and inspire action. The city's South Side became both his home and his proving ground. He was about to take his first big leap into elected office, and with it, the first true test of whether hope could survive the realities of politics. First steps into politics and a speech that changed everything. Politics in Chicago was no gentle climb. It was a brawl, full of sharp elbows, closed doors, and unwritten rules. But Barack had something the machine politicians didn't: patience, listening skills, and the ability to connect with people from every walk of life. In 1996, he ran for the Illinois State Senate. Some doubted him, some dismissed him, but Barack's campaign wasn't built on handshakes in boardrooms. It was built on door knocks, living room conversations, and showing up where it mattered. He won. And suddenly, the young community organizer was now Senator Obama. In the state Senate, he worked on ethics reform, health care for low-income families, and early childhood education. He didn't grandstand. He built coalitions, even across party lines, something rare then and rarer now. But in 2000, he made a bold move. He challenged an incumbent U.S. congressman for a seat in the House. And he lost. Badly. The defeat stung. It made him question whether politics was really his path. Still, Michelle reminded him, it's not about the loss, it's about the work. So, Barack kept showing up. And in 2004, he decided to run for the U.S. Senate. This time, the momentum felt different. His message of unity, of finding common ground, resonated far beyond Chicago. Then came a moment that would change everything. The Democratic National Convention. July 27, 2004. Barack Obama was invited to give the keynote address. For many, it was their first time hearing his voice. And from the moment he stepped on stage, something was different.
He spoke not just about policies, but about the American story. one of hope, struggle, and possibility. About how his father had grown up herding goats in Kenya, how his mother had been born in Kansas, and how their son could stand before the nation because America made room for dreams like theirs. Hidden gem fact number 5. That 2004 speech was written in just a few weeks, and Barack edited it by hand until the night before. By the time he left the stage, he wasn't just a Senate candidate. He was a rising star. The crowd roared. The nation leaned in. And the question shifted again. Could this man one day be president?
The road to the White House. Winning the U.S. Senate seat in 2004 was a landslide. Barack arrived in Washington, D.C. as the only African American in the Senate at the time. The halls of power were imposing. Marble floors, grand chambers, the weight of history in every echoing step. But he didn't let the grandeur distract him. He focused on legislation that mattered: nuclear nonproliferation, veterans care, ethics reform. And he traveled to Africa, to the Middle East, to communities across America, listening, learning, connecting. Still, whispers grew louder. People asked him in interviews, at rallies, even in airports, "When are you going to run for president?" At first, he brushed it off. He was still new, still learning the game. But by 2006, the idea no longer seemed impossible. The nation was weary of war, of division, of politics as usual. And Barack offered something rare, a sense of hope that felt both authentic and urgent. In February 2007, standing in the freezing air outside the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, he made it official. He was running for president. From the start, the campaign felt different. There were no political dynasties behind him, no decades of Washington power, just a message. Yes, we can.
Crowds swelled into the tens of thousands. Young people who had never voted before showed up. Volunteers poured in from every state, knocking on doors, making phone calls, donating in small amounts that added up to something massive. The Democratic primary was a showdown with Hillary Clinton, a seasoned politician, deeply respected and widely seen as the frontrunner. It was a battle of ideas, momentum, and sheer stamina. Barack's team embraced technology in ways campaigns hadn't before, using social media, online fundraising, and grassroots networks to match Clinton's political machinery. By the time he clinched the nomination, history was within reach. But the general election would be another mountain, against Republican Senator John McCain, a war hero with decades of service. The 2008 campaign unfolded against the backdrop of an economic crisis. Banks collapsed, jobs vanished, families lost homes, and in the middle of it all, Barack stood on stage after stage, telling Americans not just what was wrong, but what could be made right. Crowds swelled into the tens of thousands. Young people who had never voted before showed up. Volunteers poured in from every state, knocking on doors, making phone calls, donating in small amounts that added up to something massive. The Democratic primary was a showdown with Hillary Clinton, a seasoned politician, deeply respected and widely seen as the frontrunner. It was a battle of ideas, momentum, and sheer stamina. Barack's team embraced technology in ways campaigns hadn't before, using social media, online fundraising, and grassroots networks to match Clinton's political machinery. By the time he clinched the nomination, history was within reach. But the general election would be another mountain, against Republican Senator John McCain, a war hero with decades of service.
The 2008 campaign unfolded against the backdrop of an economic crisis. Banks collapsed, jobs vanished, families lost homes. And in the middle of it all, Barack stood on stage after stage, telling Americans not just what was wrong, but what could be made right.
In his first months, Barack pushed through an economic stimulus plan aimed at saving jobs, investing in infrastructure, and stabilizing the system. It was controversial. Some called it too big, others too small, but it stopped the bleeding. That first year also brought one of his signature achievements, the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare, as it came to be known, aimed to expand healthcare coverage to millions of uninsured Americans. It was a brutal legislative fight. Town halls erupted in shouting matches, political lines hardened, but in March 2010, he signed it into law, the biggest healthcare reform in decades. Internationally, Barack sought a different tone. He gave a speech in Cairo aimed at resetting America's relationship with the Muslim world. He ordered the closing of CIA black sites used for interrogations, and in 2011, after years of intelligence work, he authorized the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Still, the presidency was no fairy tale. Wars dragged on in Iraq and Afghanistan. The political climate at home grew more polarized. The rise of the Tea Party movement fueled fierce opposition to his policies.
Yet Barack remained steady in his public demeanor, measured, thoughtful, sometimes infuriatingly calm to his critics. In 2012, he ran for re-election against Republican Mitt Romney. The campaign was tight, the debates intense. But once again, Barack built a coalition that carried him to victory. 4 more years. His second term brought new battles over immigration, climate change, gun control. He used executive orders to protect millions of undocumented immigrants from deportation. He signed the Paris Climate Agreement, committing the U.S. to global environmental action. And after a tragic mass shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, he pushed for gun reforms, but Congress refused to act. Perhaps one of his most symbolic moments came in 2015 when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. That evening, the White House lit up in rainbow colors. Barack called it a victory for love, for equality, for America's promise. By the time he left office in January 2017, his approval rating was among the highest for a departing president in recent history. But the nation he left behind was divided, hopeful in some corners, resentful in others. History, as always, would have the final say.
Beyond the presidency and the power of legacy. January 20th, 2017. Barack Obama left the White House with grace, hand in hand with Michelle, the crowd sending them off with cheers and tears. For the first time in 8 years, he was no longer the man with the nuclear codes, no longer the daily headline, but the story was far from over. He stayed in Washington, unusual for a former president, so his youngest daughter, Sasha, could finish high school. The move was practical, but it also kept him close to the political heartbeat. Almost immediately, people wondered, what's next? Barack made it clear he wasn't going to vanish. He began working on his memoirs, reflecting not just on policy, but on the human moments of the presidency. In 2020, the first volume, A Promised Land, was released, a sweeping, introspective account that became a global bestseller. Michelle's memoir, Becoming, had already taken the world by storm, inspiring millions with her personal journey. Together, they were no longer just political figures, they were cultural icons. Through the Obama Foundation, they focused on leadership programs, civic engagement, and inspiring the next generation. They created a Netflix production company, telling stories that mattered, stories that elevated voices too often unheard.
When the COVID-19 pandemic swept the world, Barack re-emerged in the public conversation, offering calm, science-based guidance and speaking to graduates in virtual commencements about resilience and hope.
He also didn't shy away from political battles. He campaigned for candidates he believed in, weighed in on issues of democracy and justice, and spoke out after the killing of George Floyd, urging the country toward reform. And yet, he often reminded people, the future wasn't his to write anymore. It belonged to those willing to step forward. The best way to honor the progress we've made, he said, is to keep pushing forward. Now, years after that boy stood on a beach in Hawaii, wondering who he was, Barack Obama's answer is clear. He is a son of two continents. A husband. A father. A leader shaped by loss, lifted by hope, and defined by the belief that the arc of history bends toward justice. But only if people make it bend. His life is a reminder that identity isn't something you're handed. It's something you build. Piece by piece. Choice by choice. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to the world is the same thing he said on that cold day in 2008. Yes, we can. So, as you close this video, think about the questions he once asked himself. Who am I? What can I do? And then, answer them in your own way. Because history is still being written. And the next chapter, it might just have your name on it. If you want more unforgettable journeys like this, subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story.